Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that I think is pretty important to all of us, and that is getting a good night's sleep. And so we're going to talk about why sleep is important, what we know about sleep in autism, and some things that you can try at home to help yourself or your child with autism or any other family members get a better night's sleep. So the good news is that a lot of the tips that we're going to be talking about can be really helpful for people of all ages. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to just talk about why we're focusing on sleep today. So surprisingly, when you think about it, we spend about 1/3 of our lives sleeping, which tells us that sleep must be pretty important if our brains and bodies do spend so much time on it. And actually, sleep is a pretty basic human need and a basic animal need, actually. No animal can survive without sleep, and neither can we. It's really vital for our health and the health of our minds and bodies. Scientists actually don't really know all there is to know about the purpose of sleep and the functions that our brains go through during sleep, but we do know that it's really, really helpful for our brains and bodies to restore, to strengthen, and to repair. So it's a pretty essential activity. Sleep actually helps our immune systems work at their best. It helps us to fight off illnesses and stay healthy. So right now, of all times, sleep is probably more important than ever for all of us. It's actually also a time when we can grow muscles and we can repair muscles that may have been damaged during the day. So sleep is a time for our bodies to kind of get fixed up and ready for being active the next day. Another thing that's really important about sleep is that it's a time for us to process emotions. So negative or positive emotions that happen and occur to us throughout the day, at night, our brains process that and help us to prepare to deal with things when we wake up the next day. I think all of us have probably had nights where we didn't sleep as well, and so you definitely notice a change in mood the next day a lot of times. Sleep is pretty important for emotional functioning. It's also really important for learning and memory, and we know that overnight, as we sleep, information is transferred from our short-term memory into our long-term memory, which is really, really important for us. And sleep helps us to clean out unnecessary information in our brains, kind of like cleaning out your hard drive when you reboot your computer. So it helps us to perform at our best. When we've done studies of people who are sleep deprived compared to those who had a good night's sleep, we know that you do much better on tasks of learning and memory and concentration after you've had a good night's sleep. So when we're talking about autism and thinking about children with autism, I think sleep is even more important to focus on because we know that they're facing extra challenges and struggles with health and emotion and learning. So ensuring that they're able to get a really good night's sleep is especially important. So what is sleep? When we sleep, sometimes you think that you just kind of shut down and don't do very much, but actually it's a pretty dynamic process, and our minds and bodies don't just shut down. They engage in restoration and processing, just like we talked about. There are two different phases of sleep that you'll hear people discuss. One is called rapid eye movement phase, sleep phase, and the other phase is non-REM sleep phase. And so you go through different phases of sleep throughout the night in which your brain and body is doing different things. There are two different ways that our brains kind of turn sleep on and off. One is called the homeostatic drive, and basically that's a sleep drive. That is how sleepy you feel. And I think we all recognize that drive because as the day moves forward, you have more and more of a pressure to sleep that builds up over the day. And this is actually caused by the buildup of a neurotransmitter in your brain called adenosine. And it builds up over the course of the day. And then as you sleep at night, it goes back down. So that's one part of the process. The other thing that helps us to regulate sleep is called the circadian rhythm. And basically, that's our internal clock or our brain clock that keeps us on a 24-hour cycle. And it's really helpful for us. It's a part of our brain that lets us know when it's time to be awake and active and when it's time to go to sleep. So these two kind of processes work together. And as part of that system, as part of the internal brain clock system, our brains actually produce a hormone called melatonin. And that hormone helps us know when it's time to fall asleep at night. So in a really cool way, melatonin is very sensitive to the environment. So the production of melatonin in our brains is triggered by changes in light. So as the day goes forward and it begins to get dark at night, our brains produce more of that hormone, and it tells our brains, oh, it's time to start to go to sleep. And then the levels drop again as the morning becomes bright. So you can see this as a really nice natural process that helps us know, when it's time to do certain things and when it's time for our bodies to rest and recover. And if we follow these natural cycles, we'll get just the right amount of sleep. But unfortunately, due to modern technologies and lots of other things, there are things that can throw off that circadian rhythm. A lot of times you'll decide to go to bed later than usual on some days, or your work schedule may change, or there just could be something that can interfere with your schedule that could throw things off. Something else that really can have an effect is that we spend a lot of time indoors now, especially right now. And if you don't have a lot of natural light inside, that may throw off your circadian rhythms. At the same time, if you're exposed to a lot of bright light in the evenings, it may confuse your brain clock as well. So all of those things working together can make it harder to fall asleep at the right time. So when we think about children, one other thing I want to touch on is just how much sleep children need. And that's actually depending on how old they are. So all of you who have had children or who have children know that newborns spend a ton of time sleeping, and even older infants between ages 4 and 12 months are spending most of their time asleep. And so you can see here what the recommendations are from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. But through most of childhood, children are spending a lot of time sleeping. Even school-age children need to spend up to 40% of their time sleeping. So what that tells us is that sleep is really important, and it's actually the brain's primary activity in early childhood, which means that it's important for healthy brain development. So what do we know about sleep in children with autism, and why are we talking about this today? Actually, most kids on the spectrum will experience really significant sleep problems or clinical sleep problems at some point in childhood. And our research is showing that a lot of those problems, if they're not treated, can persist on into adolescence and adulthood. So probably if you're on the call today and you are on the spectrum or you have a child with autism, you know that this can be a struggle for a lot of folks. We also know that the most common types of sleep problems in people with autism are insomnia or trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, and then just having poor quality sleep. So feeling like you're not getting enough rest or you're sleeping restlessly. So I think one of the things that's important to consider is that because of what we know about how important sleep is for health and development, and how important it is for learning and emotion, I think poor sleep can have an even greater impact on children with autism because they have additional struggles that they need to manage. So it would be really helpful for their brains to be all ready to do that the next day. But we know that poor sleep in children with autism can interfere with their learning. It makes it harder for them to pay attention in school and to regulate their behavior and emotion. So I think this really highlights how important it is that we all work together to try to help children get a better night's sleep. So what could be causing these kinds of problems for children and adults on the spectrum? We don't have all the answers to that question yet, but we do know that people with autism are at higher risk for medical problems that can interfere with sleep. So one example would be gastrointestinal problems, GI problems. That can cause problems sleeping because you're uncomfortable or may have acid reflux. Epilepsy and seizure disorders also interfere with sleep. And lots of medications have effects on sleep, both over-the-counter medications and prescriptions. And so when kids on the spectrum are taking medications for various concerns that they may have, that may have a negative effect on their sleep at night. And sometimes, in some cases, children may have really specific sleep disorders like sleep apnea, narcolepsy, or restless leg syndrome. So whenever you're having problems sleeping, it's really important to partner with your child's doctor or primary care provider so that you can work as a team to make sure that there aren't any of these medical problems that could be addressed. There are also some other aspects of autism that I think make it hard for children to fall asleep at night as well. So we know that children and adults on the spectrum have differences in the way that their brains develop that might make them especially sensitive to things that could get in the way of sleep. Some examples of that are that if you're really reactive to the sensory environment, you might have trouble tuning out some of those things in your sleep environment that most people don't pay as much attention to. So that might make it harder for you to settle down at night. If there's extra light coming in or noises from the room next door, those kinds of things could get in the way of sleep. Also, stress and anxiety are really challenging and for people on the spectrum, and that can really make it hard to sleep when it's time to go to bed at night. It can just be hard to unwind physically and to stop your brain from thinking about anxious thoughts. And then finally, we know that if someone has problems communicating or understanding language, they may not understand the cues that it's time to get ready for bed. So for all of those reasons, I think I wanted to just highlight that we need to sometimes think about extra supports that we can put in place to make it easier for children's brains and bodies to get ready for sleep, and maybe some extra support than we would need to do for children without autism. So for the rest of our time today, I'm going to talk about some strategies that you can use at home to start to help your child get better sleep at night. We're not going to talk about any medication or medical strategies today. I'm going to give you some things that you can start with right away at home. And we'll talk about daytime, things you can do during the daytime to make sleep easier, things to do at night, and then just the sleep environment itself and how to set that up for success. So again, all of these things are fairly easy things you can do to make sure that your child's brain and body are just really ready for sleep when it's time to sleep, and that your child can learn the difference between daytime and nighttime. So let's go ahead and get started with daytime activities. I think sometimes it may seem a little strange to be thinking about daytime activities when we're talking about sleep, but it turns out that what we do during the day can have a pretty big impact on our sleep at night. So it's important as a really first step for children to learn early on that daytime is the time to be active and alert. And so the first step for that is to make sure that your kids and yourself actually get up at the same time every morning, even though that might be pretty hard right now because I think our schedules are pretty messed up and we may not need to be out the door at the same time. It's still important to keep the same wake time because we don't want to confuse our internal clocks because that's going to make us less sleepy when it's time to go to bed at night. So one suggestion for getting kids up and awake and ready to rise and shine is to think about opening the blinds, opening the curtains, turning on the lights, and getting that natural light in that can help with that circadian rhythm that we talked about earlier. So that's going to suppress melatonin. One really interesting technology that's come out in recent years is this idea of an alarm clock that I have a picture here of one that we actually have. And it simulates natural light about 15 minutes before the alarm goes off. So gradually the room gets brighter. And so that's a really nice way, if you have a room that's dark and your child may not have a lot of natural light in there, this could be something you could try to help their bodies wake up a little bit earlier. So the next thing I just want to mention is that sometimes it's helpful to have a schedule or a really consistent morning routine so that kids know what to expect in the morning when they wake up. And that can help them start to make that distinction between day and night. So here's an example. I think we've had some really great webinars that have some tips about how to make a visual schedule. And there's some good examples on the Autism Drive that you can access as well. But this is a pretty simple one. So for children or adults who need a little bit of extra visual cue, you could have a list of things that are going to happen every morning. So wake up is the first thing, and then you can see on this schedule, the child is going to make their bed as the first step. And I think that's important because it's a way to make sure that the child gets out of bed. Sometimes people have a desire or a tendency to want to snooze or just lay in bed for a while, but it's really better to get up, rise and shine, get out of bed and get active to help sort of activate your body. So making the bed would be a good way to do that. Getting dressed is another example of something that can help transition from bedtime, sleepy time, pajamas, to my daytime clothes. These are things that I'm going to wear when I'm active and awake. So that's another way that you might think about doing that. And we've talked about this already, but I think it is worth repeating, that you want to make sure that we're giving our bodies and brains a lot of light during the day, because our brain's internal clock is really sensitive to light. And that's going to help us feel awake and alert and will suppress melatonin. In general, natural light is going to be the best if possible. And the best way to do that is to get outside. So if it's a nice day, spending some time outside if you can is really helpful. If not, just try to turn the lights on and keep the windows open and bright if you can. Physical activity is also really important for sleep. Another great resource for this is Dr. Marty Block's live virtual event on physical activity, which can be found on the Autism Drive. And it has some really great ideas about how to keep your kids active, even when we're stuck inside sometimes. So for sleep benefits, we want to try to aim for at least 30 minutes every day. More is better if you can do that, but being active and getting that activity during the day is going to help you sleep more at night. So if you can figure out a way to do that outside, then that allows you to have some natural light as well as your physical activity. A couple of other points I just want to make about daytime is that you want to try to make sure that your child is using their bed just for sleep. And that's because you want your child to make a strong association between their bed and being relaxed and restful. If your child is using their bed for lots of exciting things like playing video games or rough and tumble play, or really stressful things like being put in timeout in their bed or doing really stressful homework, they may start to develop a negative association between being in bed and just having a negative association with the bed. So that's going to make it harder to relax. I think we've all probably had negative experiences where you were in a certain place when something bad happened, and then after that, every time you are in that place, you have that negative feeling. We don't want that to happen for children or adults with bed. So you want the bed to be relaxing and comforting, not energizing or stressful. So another idea is to make sure that active, stimulating toys are in a different place, either in the room or in the home, so that your child's not tempted to use their bed for those things. Just a quick note about naps. If your child is a toddler or a preschooler, they may still need a nap, and that's just fine. Just try to keep it as early in the day as possible. Try to end it by 4 o'clock if you can. For older children and for adults, I think of napping like snacking on sleep. The more you snack, the less you're going to want to eat the meal when it's time to eat. So try to avoid naps unless your child is very young. Okay, so the next tip that I think most of us are aware of is that caffeine can really make you feel awake and alert, but it can also make it hard to sleep. What you may not realize is that caffeine can actually stay in your system for up to 10 to 12 hours. So even if you drink something with caffeine earlier in the day, it can still have an effect on sleep. And it's found in, I think, way more foods and drinks than people might realize. It's definitely in coffee, but it's also in tea and many sodas. Caffeine can be found in chocolate and ice cream and different candies. So it's important to check the nutrition labels pretty carefully to make sure that your child's not consuming caffeine and you're not aware of it. In general, because children with autism are sometimes even more sensitive to things than other children, caffeine may have more of an effect on their sleep than we realize. So we would recommend that you just try to avoid it and eliminate caffeine totally if possible. There's a lot, in many cases for soda and other beverages, you can choose a caffeine-free alternative that tastes very similar. So moving on from daytime to bedtime, there are a few things that I think it's important to try to take out of your schedule. One of those is to try to eliminate really active, energizing play in the hour before bed, because you're going to want your child, just as daytime is for being active and alert, nighttime should be for getting ready for sleep and rest. So try to schedule those activities earlier in the day. You want to avoid eating heavy meals before bed because that can activate your digestive system and make it harder to rest. And then the last thing that I want to mention is that sometimes having just stressful conversations or arguments or things right before bed can really interfere with somebody's ability to wind down and go to sleep. So if you need to have, for older children or teenagers, if you need to have a really serious discussion or talk about something stressful, try to schedule that at a time that's earlier in the day, not in the hour before bed, to give your child a little time to deal with their emotions before it's time to get ready. I also want to take just a minute to talk about screen time. This is probably the hardest thing for families to manage around bedtime. We do know that screen time can really get in the way of a good night's sleep, both for children and for adults. And I know it's something that right now most adults are dealing with, how to turn screens off in the evenings to get to sleep. Screens include things like phones, TVs, tablets, and video games. They're bad for sleep for a couple of reasons. One is that they emit light, which can suppress our melatonin levels and make us less sleepy. And then they also can be very stimulating. So it could be stimulating because it's really fun if you're playing a video game, which turns our brains on instead of helping them to shut down. Or it could be stressful. So if you're reading the news or something that's going to get you stressed out right before bed, that's going to be counterproductive for sleep. And actually, we've done in our lab some work around the issue of screen use and how it affects sleep in children with autism. And we found, for example, in this one study that I'm showing here, that for children who used children with autism who use screens as part of their bedtime routine, it took them over twice as long to fall asleep at night, and they were getting less sleep overall. That was also the case for, in a different study, if children had bedroom media devices like TVs or computers in their rooms, they got less sleep than children who did not. So I would suggest trying to just remove screens from the bedroom if possible, and definitely trying to power things down an hour before bedtime if you can. For some families, this is really challenging. So I would say just try your best and maybe gradually reduce the time over time. And some devices allow you to turn down the brightness setting, which could be helpful. In terms of a bedtime routine, we talked about a morning routine, but I think it's maybe even more important for sleep to have a really nice, predictable, consistent bedtime schedule. So you want to make sure that your child goes to bed at the same time. And you can kind of help them develop some ideas about what the cues are for getting ready for sleep. Visual schedules, again, can be a really great way to do this. So when you're making your schedule and your routine, you want to think about the activities that are calming and relaxing for your child and things that are going to help them wind down and get into a good place for sleep. So here are some examples. Listening to quiet music can be helpful. Taking a warm bath for some children and adults can be really relaxing. Reading, listening to stories, singing songs, saying prayers, anything like that can be put into your bedtime routine. And then over time, having that routine is going to help your child's brain and body recognize that it's getting to be time for sleep. And that can give them cues that they need to develop good habits on their own. So another thing to think about is how the child's sleep environment is set up. And we've talked a lot about the role of light in sleep. So I think it's probably not going to be a surprise that I'm going to recommend keeping the room as dark as possible. One way that can be helpful to do that, if you have windows where a lot of light is coming in, blackout curtains can be really helpful to make the room a lot darker. especially if you have a window with a street light or something outside that's bringing light in. Another thing that can interfere with sleep are sometimes the power cords on devices in our rooms have lights on them. So just do a scan of your child's bedroom and make sure that any of those things are unplugged or covered up so that that light source is not coming in. Keeping things quiet is also really helpful, especially because children with autism are going to be more sensitive both to light and to sound. If you can't ensure a totally quiet room, which is probably the case for most people, a fan or some other white noise can really help drown out some of that background sound. So that can be a nice, inexpensive way to keep things a little quieter. Another thing we know about the sleep environment is that actually cooler temperatures are a little bit better for sleep. So keeping the room cool, making sure it's not too hot at night is going to help. And then because of sensory sensitivities, we want to make sure that our kids are comfortable in the pajamas they're wearing and in the bedding. Some children and some adults like to have a little bit more pressure, so they might want a heavier blanket. So if that's the case, it's extra important to make sure that the room itself is cool. And then the last point I want to make here is that you want to make sure that whatever is the case when the child falls asleep stays the same throughout the night. Because if something is a certain way when the child falls asleep, if they wake up in the middle of the night and it's different, they're going to have a harder time falling back asleep, and they might come into your room and ask for help. So that's going to interfere with your sleep. The reason why I think we want to minimize that is, and help kids to do a better job of falling asleep on their own, is that for that same reason, if they need you in the room with them to be able to fall asleep, if they wake up, they're not going to be able to get back to sleep unless you're there. So kids have a lot of really good strategies for keeping us in the room with them. They might stall, they might have what I call curtain calls, where they're, oh, I just need one more hug, or I need one more drink, or just insisting that mom or dad be in the room with them. And some kids have trouble falling asleep unless they're in the same bed as a parent. So you might need to help your child, just as they have learned to fall asleep with your guidance, with you in the room, you might have to teach them to fall asleep without you. And that can be maybe sometimes a gradual process, and it can be challenging. So you want to make sure that your expectations are clear, that you're not giving a lot of positive reinforcement if they're doing all these curtain calls. And over time, you can wait a little bit longer before you go in the hopes that the child might just fall back asleep. Using rewards or positive consequences can also be helpful for older children. So, you know, if they were able to stay in their bed, they can get a sticker that can be traded in for something later on. Another tool that could be helpful is having a bedtime pass. So the child can turn in this pass in exchange for one hug or one drink of water, but they can only use it one time. So that can help them develop some self-control around doing that. These strategies are a little bit harder to implement. So I've listed some resources here that I think are really helpful, and they're going to have some more specific guidance and instructions on how to help your child fall asleep on their own. The strategies to improve sleep toolkits are both free, and they're available both on the Autism Speaks website and on our Autism Drive. So those are really great resources. The book that's in the middle here is an excellent book written for parents that goes through lots of different strategies in much more detail. And this book was written by Terry Katz and Beth Mallow, who are both experts in sleep and autism. So you can find that book on Amazon if you're interested in that. And then I just want to put another plug in for the Autism Drive, where we have many more resources that you can search and access easily online. So that is it for my slideshow. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Genevieve for questions.
Great. Well, I'll hop in for a moment. Thank you so much, Micah, for that presentation. Sleep is one of my favorite topics, and hearing the presentation made me look forward to going to sleep tonight. So I appreciate all those great tips. We're going to start our Q&A session, and Dr. Genevieve Bohach is going to oversee it. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat box at the bottom. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Moira, and wonderful presentation, Micah. I feel like you've been seeing my bedtime routine with my 3 children with all your tips. So I'm going to hear you tonight as I struggle through putting them to bed. So we have quite a lot of interest in sleep for children, and quite a few questions have come in. So I'm going to kind of start at the beginning. You said that infants obviously require much more sleep than older children, and I think many of us that are parents know that. Are there other developmental stages that you have seen that have difficulties or impacts on sleep for children?
That's a really great question. And I think probably the biggest shift that people experience happens in adolescence when our sleep schedule really shifts. And so when kids go through puberty, start to want to stay up later, and then they need to sleep in a little bit later. So that can be a challenge, especially if high schools have really early start times. It can be hard for kids. So I think probably if you have a school-age child, you can expect some changes in sleep needs as they go into adolescence.
Great, thank you so much. It's a great tip for all of us who don't have them yet. So speaking of teenagers, what about teenagers with autism and anxiety? This individual says their daughter has trouble falling asleep because they're worried about things that happen during the day. Any ideas on how to help them?
Thank you for that question. I think that is something that a lot of people on the spectrum and off the spectrum struggle with. Anxiety can really interfere with our ability to go to sleep. And sometimes, I think we've all probably had an experience of being stressed out about something and trying to fall asleep, and all you can do is think about the thing you're worried about, and it makes it just that much harder. And then you start to focus on the clock and thinking, I need to get to sleep so I can get up the next day and deal with this thing I'm worried about. So I think that's something we can all relate to. One, in addition to having a routine that's exactly the same and predictable, that's getting your brain and body ready for sleep, that's going to help. I think building things into that routine that are relaxation based could be helpful for anxiety. We had a virtual live event with Dr. Erica Rao maybe several weeks ago focused on anxiety. So that could be a good resource for this family to take a look at for some ideas to how to relax before you get to bed at night. Another suggestion that has worked for a lot of families that I've worked with is having a worry journal that you're gonna write in at a different time. So that's helpful because if you know, okay, this is an issue, but I have a time and space to deal with it, it makes it less likely that you're gonna ruminate and kind of cycle through those worries at nighttime. The other suggestion that I have for teenagers and adults who are struggling with sleep is that if you're finding that you're laying in bed, not able to sleep, and you're running through all these thoughts, get out of bed and go do something else, because we want to build that really strong association between bed and sleep. And if you're starting to get anxious and stressed out, it's way better to just get out of bed and go read a book and do something else until you feel sleepy, and then you can come back to bed.
Those are great suggestions, and thanks for pointing out that other webinar that Erica did. It's on our Facebook and also on Autism Drive, so it's a great reference for people. So what happens if the bedtime routine is the stressor? Is there any way to get around that or to maybe help alleviate that stress?
That is a really great question. I think for a lot of families, it can be a stressor both for the child and for the parent. So I would go back to the bedtime routine and really think carefully about what is in there. So if you think about that, that schedule of I'm going to take a bath, I'm going to read a book, I'm going to do other things. Think about things that your child really loves and make sure to put those in there so that it's a reinforcing process. If your child gets really agitated when they brush their teeth, don't put that near the end of your list. Maybe start with that and then work through things that are more positive. That would be a suggestion as a start.
Great, thank you. I'll be using that tonight with my son. So we had some questions come in about melatonin, which you mentioned earlier in your presentation. Have you seen evidence that the supplement of melatonin is effective for children with autism?
Yes, thank you for that question. I will start by saying I'm a psychologist and not a physician, so I'm not going to give any medical advice on the call today. My colleague Beth Mallow, who wrote the book that was in the middle of that slide, is an expert on this topic, and she's done a lot of research on the use of melatonin. And her work has found that it can be effective in helping children fall asleep. And there's actually a guide that's available on, it's a toolkit for families on the Autism Speaks website, and it's on our Autism Drive. I can't remember the title of it, but I think it's just called Melatonin Use for Autism, and it's written for families. So you can take a look there and see sort of the pros and cons and how it can be useful. But the number one suggestion I would have would be to talk with your healthcare provider and work with them, because teaming up together is going to be the best approach for that.
That's a great approach, and building that team around your child is always the most effective thing.
Yeah.
So talking about sleep supplements, anything else like white noise that you've seen that would be helpful for children to fall asleep?
Yeah, I think actually white noise is such a great tool that can be super helpful, because not only does it drown out things that are happening, especially, you know, I don't really know anybody who has a totally quiet house after it's time for the kids to go to bed. So that's a good way to drown out extraneous noise. It can become a strong cue for sleep. So just like we're building this sleep routine that can help the child's brain recognize that it's time to power down, when you turn on that white noise, that's another really clear cue that, oh, okay, now it's time to fall asleep. So I would highly recommend white noise. I think it's very helpful. The one trick is that, you know, if you're traveling and you know that you're going to need your child to fall asleep at some point, make sure you have something similar or bring it with you so that you can keep things the same.
That's a great tip. Nobody wants to go to a hotel room and then can't sleep. It's just not fun for anyone. So speaking of those sleep routines, we had some parents who have older children or teenagers. Is it okay to let them sleep in on the weekends?
I'm going to be the bearer of bad news. You know that it's really not great. I will say that, you know, a lot of people do that and they're fine, but these are people who don't have sleep problems. So if your child is struggling with sleep, it's really not great to have different schedules during the week and on the weekends. So what you want to do is help regulate and kind of follow that natural circadian rhythm so that you're keeping the same schedule every 24 hours. So, you know, that's not always going to happen, and you're going to have weekend nights where you may be staying up way later than usual, but it's good to try for that if you can.
My teenage self did not appreciate that comment, Micah.
I don't appreciate it myself. I like to sleep in on the weekends.
Right, we all want to sleep in sometimes. So I'm going to get a little more serious right now because of the pandemic. So is it common to see sleep disturbances since we've all been staying at home? We have a parent who said, my child's sleep was under control, not great, but under control. But then we're staying home and they feel like they've lost control of it all.
That is not uncommon at all, actually. I think there's a perfect storm of things that can get in the way of sleep for us right now. One is that we're spending way more time inside than we are maybe used to. So even if you just think about getting to the car or going to the bus and getting off the bus, you're exposed to natural light a lot more than you are if you're in your house. So that can interfere with sleep. It's also harder to keep to a schedule. Like there may be less motivation to get up at the same time in the morning than there is if you have to leave the house and go to school or work. So that can make it hard. And then the third thing is that it's just a really stressful situation right now. So we're all dealing with just a ton of different kinds of stressors, whether it has to do with jobs or worried about health or actually getting sick, or just different situations that are changes from usual. And so those stressors can make it harder to fall asleep at night too. And I've actually heard people say that they're having really strange dreams right now, even because of all the stress that's happening, and it's affecting the way that they're dreaming. So I think the tips that we talked about can be things you could use for your whole family to start to think about having consistent schedules and different ways to make sure that during the day you're activated and awake and alert. And then when it's time to go to sleep, it's a time to unwind and get ready for that.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and it is from a parent with younger children. Is there an age that naps start actually interfering with sleep instead of helping?
That's a really great question. I think it depends on your child. Every child's a little bit different. Some kids age out of naps at age like 2.5, and other kids need them up through preschool. And it's very individual. So I would say if your child is starting to fight naps and it's a battle, then that may be a sign that it's time to phase them out, as long as they're able to get good sleep during the night and they're performing pretty well the rest of the day. So I think you'll have to use your judgment a little bit as a parent and help make that decision along with your child.
But the naps are the most peaceful time in my house, Micah. So quiet.
You can still have your children stay in their quiet rooms. They may not be sleeping in there, but
Okay, we'll work on that one. Maybe another webinar, we can talk about that.
sure.
Okay, I'll turn it back over to Moira. Thanks so much, Micah.
Thank you, Jenny. I always try to schedule quiet time during webinars, but it doesn't always work out that way. We're about out of time, so thank you everybody so much for joining us. I want to thank Micah again for that great presentation.